"It hurts. Let's try again tonight," the nun whispered, and the mountain man's patience shifted. The mountains were quiet that evening, blanketed in a soft, silvery mist that made the world seem smaller, almost secret. High up in the Rockies, where jagged peaks cut the sky and pine trees whispered with the wind, lived a man who had long ago chosen solitude over company. He was called Father Thomas by those who knew him from a distance, though he was not a priest in the traditional sense. He had once been a teacher, a man who loved the world of books and knowledge, but life had turned harsh, and he had turned inward. Now he was known simply as the Mountain Man, a figure wrapped in mystery, living alone in a small, weathered cabin he had built with his own hands. He had learned to survive in ways most people could not imagine. The cold mountain nights were long and unforgiving, and every morning demanded work. He chopped wood for fire, gathered water from a frozen stream, and hunted small game with precision. The mountain gave and took in equal measure, and he had grown to respect its rules. Yet despite his skills and independence, there was a loneliness he had buried deep inside, a quiet ache that he never admitted to anyone, not even himself. That evening, as he finished stacking firewood outside his cabin, he noticed a small figure making her way up the narrow path that led to his home. She moved with determination, carrying a heavy backpack and a bundle of notebooks. At first he thought she must be lost. Very few people dared to climb these mountains, especially as the weather grew colder. He felt a mix of curiosity and caution. Most visitors were trouble-seeking stories or fame or fleeting adventure. The woman was Sister Anne, a nun sent by her order to document the lives of people living in isolated communities. She was gentle and kind, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. Her mission was clear. She wanted to understand those who had chosen life at the edges of society, to record their stories, their struggles, and their wisdom. She believed that every person had a story worth telling, even those who seemed untouchable. Father Thomas watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed. He had not spoken to another adult in months, not since the last traveler had wandered off down the mountain after a day of curiosity. His life was orderly, solitary, and simple. Every interruption was a potential disturbance to the delicate balance he had built. He studied the approaching figure, unsure whether to greet her or let her pass. When she reached the cabin, she raised a hand in greeting, her voice soft but firm. "Hello, sir. My name is Sister Anne. I hope I'm not intruding." Thomas's first instinct was to close the door, to retreat to the warmth of his fire and pretend he had not seen her. But something in her tone made him pause. There was no demand, no rush, no hint of judgment, only quiet respect. He nodded slowly and stepped aside, allowing her to enter the small cabin. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine, smoke, and the faint scent of earth. It was small but orderly, with a single bed in the corner, a table scattered with papers, and shelves lined with books he had read and reread countless times. Sister Anne looked around with curiosity, but she did not speak. She placed her backpack on the floor and unrolled her notebooks, flipping through pages filled with careful handwriting. "I've been sent to document life in remote areas," she said quietly, sensing the tension in the room. "I hope you don't mind my visit. I only want to listen, to learn about your life here." Thomas studied her for a long moment. He was not used to people who simply listened. Most visitors tried to change him, to question his choices, or worse, to judge them. Yet here was a woman who seemed genuinely interested in understanding, without pretense or agenda. Something about that honesty stirred a part of him he thought was long buried. He gestured toward a chair. "Sit," he said gruffly. "But I warn you, I do not speak much." Sister Anne smiled faintly and took the seat. opening her notebook as if she had done this 1,000 times before. She did not rush him, did not press him for words. She waited, allowing the silence to stretch between them. At first, Thomas fidgeted, unsure what to say. The quiet was almost deafening, but not in a way that demanded conversation. It was the kind of quiet that forced reflection, that revealed the shape of one's own thoughts. Finally, he began to speak in low, measured tones. The mountains. They teach you patience. They do not forgive haste. They do not reward arrogance. Everything takes time. Everything requires respect. Sister Anne nodded, jotting down notes, though she was more focused on listening than recording. She sensed that his words carried more than practical advice. They were lessons learned from a life of solitude, from hardship endured and observed. Over the next few hours, they talked cautiously, carefully navigating the invisible boundaries between stranger and companion. He spoke of winters that seemed endless, of streams that froze before spring arrived, and of nights when the howl of wolves echoed through the valleys, reminding him of the fragility of life. She shared little about herself, keeping her focus on understanding him, but there was an unspoken connection, a quiet acknowledgement that they were both seeking something. He, the comfort of understanding without intrusion, and she, the truth of life at the edge of the world. As the sky darkened and shadows stretched across the cabin, a gentle wind rattled the window panes. Thomas moved to stoke the fire, and Sister Anne watched him, noting the care with which he handled every task. There was pride in his work, but also weariness, a weight he carried silently. She wondered what had brought him to this isolated life, what stories lay hidden behind the rugged exterior, and how much pain he had learned to keep to himself. He glanced at her briefly. It is rare for someone to climb these mountains. Rarer still for someone to come and simply listen, he said. His voice was softer now, almost hesitant, as if he feared the words might break the fragile barrier he had maintained around himself. Sister Anne smiled gently. I believe everyone has a story, and sometimes it is not about asking questions. It is about being present and letting the story find its own voice. For the first time in months, Thomas felt a flicker of something he had not known in a long while. Not exactly comfort, not exactly friendship, but the beginning of trust. He did not speak further, but he did not move away. He allowed her to stay, to exist within his carefully constructed world, without fear or judgment. As night fell, the wind grew colder, and the shadows lengthened. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing toward the low ceiling. Thomas and Sister Anne sat in a quiet rhythm, neither needing to fill the silence with words. The mountains outside were vast and unyielding, but inside that small cabin, a fragile connection had begun, a connection that would slowly, carefully, change both of their lives. Little did they know that this first encounter, quiet and unremarkable to any observer, would mark the start of a journey neither of them could have predicted. A journey that would test patience, reveal hidden pain, and teach lessons about resilience, trust, and the unexpected ways people can reach each other, even in the loneliest corners of the world. That evening ended not with dramatic revelations or declarations, but with something far rarer, the gentle opening of a heart, the first crack in a wall built over years of solitude. And as the last embers of the fire glowed, and the mountains stood silent outside, Father Thomas could not yet know that his carefully guarded life was about to shift in ways he could not yet imagine. The next morning the mountain air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the higher peaks. Father Thomas woke before dawn, as he always did, and moved quietly around the cabin. He did not want to disturb Sister Anne, who had chosen to sleep on the small cot in the corner of the room. The fire had died down to a soft bed of embers, and the cabin felt cold and silent, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the day to begin. Sister Anne had already risen. She was sitting by the window, notebook open in her lap, writing quietly. Her hair was tucked neatly under her scarf, and her eyes, though tired, were alert and thoughtful. She was not one to rush, and she seemed to understand that the mountains demanded patience. Father Thomas watched her from the doorway for a moment, noticing the way she observed the world without judgment, simply seeing things as they were. "Breakfast is simple," he said, his voice still rough from disuse. "Oatmeal. Or eggs, if we're lucky." She looked up and smiled. "Simple is fine." "Simple is honest," she said. Her words carried warmth, and for the first time, he felt a sense of ease in her presence. She was not there to change him, not there to judge, only there to learn. That was rare, and it made a difference he did not fully understand. They ate together in silence, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft wind that rattled the cabin's old wooden roof. Thomas noticed that she did not try to force conversation, but he could see her watching him carefully, as if she were learning a language spoken without words. It was an unusual experience, having someone observe him without pressing for explanations, and he felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. After breakfast, they stepped outside. The sun was rising slowly, casting long shadows over the mountains and turning the snow-covered peaks golden. Thomas began his morning chores, chopping wood, filling water containers, and inspecting the small vegetable patch he had managed to maintain despite the rocky soil. Sister Anne followed him quietly, sometimes helping, sometimes just observing. She did not interfere with his rhythm, and he found himself speaking more freely than he had expected. "The mountains teach patience," he said, swinging the axe through the thick wood. "They do not care about your plans. They do not forgive mistakes. You must learn to wait, to respect what they demand." "It sounds hard," she said gently, "but I can see how it shapes you, makes you strong." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at her. "Strong, yes, but strong does not mean happy," he muttered. The words were almost inaudible, lost in the wind, but she caught them. Sister Anne's eyes softened. "Happiness is not always about strength," she said. "Sometimes it is about connection, about understanding and being understood." Thomas shook his head slightly, smiling despite himself. He was not used to this kind of conversation. Most people assumed that living in the mountains meant he wanted to be alone, that he was untouched by emotion or loss, dead laid by a bird. They did not understand the quiet ache that lingered in his chest, the loneliness that he carried with him like a shadow. Yet here was someone who seemed to sense it, without needing him to explain. As the morning progressed, they worked together to repair a small fence near the edge of the property. The fence had been damaged in a recent storm, and the wood was brittle and uneven. Thomas handed Sister Anne the tools and explained how to handle them carefully. She listened, nodded, and followed his instructions. She was capable, precise, and attentive, and he found himself respecting her in ways he had not anticipated. At one point, Thomas lost his balance on a slippery patch of soil and stumbled. Sister Anne caught him instinctively, steadying him with firm hands. Their eyes met for a moment, and there was a silent understanding that passed between them. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the subtle shift in their relationship. Trust was building, slowly but surely, in the most unexpected way. After the work was done, they sat on a large rock overlooking the valley. The wind was strong here, carrying the distant sound of a river rushing over stones. Thomas leaned back, taking a deep breath. "It is strange," he said quietly. "I have lived here for years, yet I feel that I am only beginning to understand these mountains." Sister Anne looked at him thoughtfully. "Perhaps understanding takes more than years," she said. "Perhaps it takes the right company, someone who listens and sees."
He smiled faintly, though there was a shadow in his eyes. He did not fully trust the ease of their connection yet.
Trust was difficult for him. It had been years since he had allowed anyone close, and the wounds of the past were still tender. But something about her presence, her patience, and her quiet confidence made the walls around his heart feel a little less rigid. As afternoon approached, clouds gathered over the peaks. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain began to fall, turning quickly into a cold drizzle. Thomas frowned and moved to secure the small garden and the woodpile. Sister Anne helped without complaint, working alongside him as the rain grew heavier. It was not easy, and the cold seeped through their clothes, but they persisted, each aware of the other's efforts without needing to say much. Later, when the rain finally subsided, they returned to the cabin, drenched but satisfied. Thomas built a fire, and they sat close to its warmth, drying their clothes and sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese. The cabin felt cozy, though the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. For a long while, they sat in silence, letting the quiet fill the room. Then, unexpectedly, Sister Anne spoke softly. "It hurts sometimes, doesn't it?" she asked, almost as if talking to herself. "The loneliness, the weight of everything we carry. But we can try again, night after night." "We can keep trying." Thomas looked at her, startled. There was something in her voice, a mixture of vulnerability and determination, that caught him off guard. He had not expected such honesty, such a simple acknowledgement of the pain that both humans and mountains could carry. Her words resonated with something buried deep inside him, stirring memories he had long kept hidden. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind outside. There was a shift within him, subtle but undeniable. He realized that patience was not only about enduring the mountains, but also about enduring the people who came into his life, the ones who challenged him, who made him face himself. Sister Anne watched him quietly, sensing the change. She did not push, did not ask for words. She simply waited, understanding that sometimes presence was more powerful than conversation. And in that quiet understanding, Thomas felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time. The possibility of connection, of letting someone see the man behind the rugged exterior. As night fell, the fire burned low, casting warm shadows across the cabin. The mountains outside were dark and silent, but inside, something had shifted. Father Thomas realized that patience could be more than endurance. It could also be the willingness to let someone in, to allow shared moments, to try again even when it was difficult. Sister Anne closed her notebook and looked at him with a gentle smile. "Tomorrow is another day," she said softly, "and we will see what it brings." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone. The mountains remained vast and unyielding, but inside the small cabin, a new kind of warmth had begun to grow, a warmth born of trust, quiet understanding, and the beginning of a fragile but real friendship. Little did they know this day was only the start. The mountains would test them, the storms would challenge them, and their patience would be tested in ways neither could yet imagine. But for now, in the quiet glow of the fire, they simply existed together, two people learning that even in isolation, human connection could find a way. The morning sun rose slowly over the mountains, painting the peaks with gold and pink streaks. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. Father Thomas and Sister Ann had fallen into a quiet routine. He moved about his cabin with the ease of someone who had lived there for years, while she followed, helping where she could and quietly observing everything else. But the stillness of the mountains could not hide the tension that had begun to grow between them. Sister Ann was determined to understand Thomas fully, but she did not realize how much her curiosity sometimes tested his patience. He was not accustomed to sharing his life so openly, and some of her questions made him uncomfortable. One morning as he chopped wood, she asked, "Do you ever miss the life you had before the mountains?" Thomas froze mid-swing, the axe hovering above the log. He took a deep breath, feeling a sharp pang of frustration. "I left that life behind for a reason," he said quietly but firmly. "I chose this life because it is honest and simple. It is free from the lies and complications of the world below." Sister Ann nodded, but her eyes were gentle. "I only want to understand, not judge," she said softly. "I know it is not easy to open up." Thomas shook his head, lowering the axe.
You mean well, I know.
"But sometimes curiosity feels like an intrusion." He looked away, scanning the forest as if he could find an answer hidden among the trees. It hurts when people try to dig into what you have built carefully. They do not see the walls, only what they want to see inside. Sister Ann stepped closer, her voice calm and soothing. "I understand," she said, "and I promise I will not push. But I hope you know that talking does not weaken you. Sharing does not take away strength." Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he returned to chopping wood, each swing deliberate and measured. Yet, despite his frustration, he felt something shift inside him. Her words, patient and gentle, had struck a chord he did not fully recognize. For the first time, he wondered if allowing someone to see him could be more than a risk. It could be a relief. By late morning, the clouds began to gather over the mountains. Dark shapes moved across the sky, promising a storm. Thomas knew the weather could turn quickly in these parts, and he gestured for Sister Ann to help secure the cabin and the small garden. The wind began to howl, bending the pine trees and sending a chill through the air. Together they worked efficiently, moving wood, tying down tarps, and securing tools. Thomas observed Sister Ann closely. She was strong, capable, and surprisingly calm under pressure. Her determination impressed him, though he would not admit it outright. They worked side by side, speaking only when necessary, letting their actions communicate understanding and trust. As the first drops of rain fell, heavier and colder than the morning mist, Thomas noticed something in himself. For years he had handled every storm alone, relying only on his skills and instincts. But now, with Sister Ann there, he realized that he did not feel the same weight of isolation. The presence of another human, willing to face the difficulties alongside him, was strange but comforting. Later, when the storm was at its peak, they retreated inside the cabin. The wind rattled the roof and the rain lashed against the small windows. Thomas sat near the fire, trying to dry his clothes, while Sister Ann scribbled quietly in her notebook. For a long while the room was filled with nothing but the sound of the storm and the crackle of the fire. Then, without warning, she spoke softly. "It hurts sometimes," she said, almost as if she were talking to herself. "The world is heavy. Loneliness is heavy. But we can try again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. That is how we endure." Thomas looked at her, caught off guard by the words. There was honesty in her voice, a quiet acknowledgement of struggle that resonated deeply with him. For a moment he felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years: understanding, connection. and perhaps even hope. The night stretched on, and the storm continued outside. Thomas could not sleep, though he tried. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, thinking about the walls he had built around himself. For years he had believed that solitude was safety. Yet now he began to question whether safety meant closing oneself off completely or learning to trust carefully, step by step. The next day brought clear skies, but the mountain paths were slick with rain, and the air was filled with the fresh smell of wet earth. Thomas and Sister Ann decided to explore a nearby trail, partly to gather firewood and partly to enjoy the calm after the storm. The trail was steep and rocky, winding through dense trees and narrow ridges. Each step required attention, and the risk of slipping was real. As they climbed, Thomas shared stories of past storms, of nights when he had faced danger alone, of moments when he had wondered if isolation was worth the price. Sister Ann listened without interruption, her expression attentive, her questions measured and thoughtful. She did not force him to reveal more than he was willing, but her presence encouraged him to speak, to confront memories he had long kept buried.
At one point, Thomas paused on a ridge, looking out over the valley below.
The river glistened in the sunlight, and the mountains rose majestically in the distance. "I have faced many storms," he said quietly, "but none are harder than the ones we carry inside ourselves. Loneliness, regret, mistakes that never leave us. They are heavier than any snow or wind." Sister Ann nodded, her eyes full of compassion. "I know," she said softly, "but sharing them, even a little, can lighten the burden. That is why we try again and again, to face the weight together." Her words struck him deeply. For the first time, he felt the possibility of trust, not just in survival, but in human connection. He realized that patience was not only about enduring storms, but also about allowing oneself to be seen, carefully, by someone who genuinely cared. The afternoon passed with quiet conversation and shared tasks. They collected firewood, repaired broken tools, and even prepared a small meal from preserved supplies. Thomas noticed the ease with which Sister Ann adapted to mountain life. She was not a visitor in the usual sense. She was becoming a companion in the truest sense of the word. Someone who shared the work, the challenges, and the quiet victories of everyday life. As evening approached, clouds gathered once more, and Thomas suggested they return to the cabin. The path was treacherous, but together they navigated the slippery slopes safely. Inside, the fire was stoked again, and they sat down to rest. Thomas poured a cup of tea for each of them, an unspoken gesture of camaraderie. For a long time they simply sat in silence, listening to the wind and rain outside. Then Sister Ann spoke again, her voice calm and gentle. "It hurts," she said, almost repeating her words from the previous night. "But we can try again. We do not give up. That is how we endure, how we grow." Thomas looked into her eyes, feeling the truth of her words. He had lived for years thinking he could face everything alone. But now he saw that endurance was not just about survival. It was about connection, patience, and the courage to let someone in. By the time night fell, the storm had passed, leaving a sky full of stars reflected in the glistening snow. Thomas felt something inside him shift. The mountains were still vast, still challenging, but inside the cabin, a new kind of warmth had taken root. It was not just the fire. It was trust, understanding, and the beginning of a fragile, meaningful bond between two people who had learned, slowly and carefully, that connection could survive even in the most isolated places. And as the night deepened, Thomas realized something important. Patience was not only about waiting, it was about trying again. over and over, until trust and understanding could take root. And for the first time, he believed that perhaps he could try again, not just with the mountains, but with the people he allowed into his life. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant snow-covered peaks. The mountains were calm now, quiet except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the whisper of wind through the trees. Father Thomas and Sister Anne had settled into an unusual rhythm. The trust between them had grown slowly, carefully, like a fragile plant pushing up through rocky soil. Yet, beneath that calm, both of them carried burdens that were not yet spoken aloud. Sister Anne had noticed the quiet way Thomas sometimes stared into the distance, as though he were thinking of a world far away. She had not asked about it yet. She knew that patience was key. The mountains demanded patience, and she had learned that the people who lived there did too. Thomas had begun to open up, but only in small pieces, offering fragments of his life like carefully chosen gifts. That morning, Thomas led her to a small plateau a few miles from the cabin. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched below, dotted with patches of snow and clusters of pine trees, and the sun cast golden light across the peaks. It was the kind of view that could make someone forget their troubles for a moment. Thomas stood silently, taking it all in, and Sister Anne followed his gaze, feeling the weight and the beauty of the world around them. "This place," Thomas began slowly, "reminds me that life is bigger than our fears and our regrets. The mountains endure storms, harsh winters, and fires, yet they remain. People, we are not so different. We endure too, but sometimes the hardest storms are the ones inside us." Sister Anne nodded, understanding more than he realized. "I think sharing those storms makes them easier," she said gently, "even if only a little." Thomas turned to look at her, his face unreadable. "It is not easy," he admitted. "I have carried a lot of pain, mistakes, regrets, things I could never undo. And for years, I thought keeping it all inside would protect me. It did not. It only made me heavier, colder." Sister Anne listened quietly. She did not interrupt or offer platitudes. She simply let him speak, and that was enough. For Thomas, speaking aloud was strange and uncomfortable, yet also relieving. Each word felt like a small release, a burden lifted just slightly. As they walked along the plateau, Thomas told her stories of his life before the mountains. He spoke of his family, who had lived far away, and the loss that had driven him to solitude. He spoke of friendships that had ended in disappointment, of opportunities that had slipped through his hands, and of dreams he had abandoned. Sister Anne listened without judgment, her presence steady, her notebook closed for the moment. She was not there to record every detail. She was there to understand him, to share in the weight of his memories. At one point, Thomas paused by a small stream, the water rushing over smooth stones. He knelt and dipped his hands into the icy water, staring at his reflection. "I thought I could survive alone," he said quietly. "I thought solitude would make me strong. But it is only when someone truly listens that strength has meaning." Sister Anne knelt beside him. "I am listening," she said simply, "and I will keep listening as long as you need." For the first time, Thomas allowed a small smile. It was faint, almost hesitant, but it was there. He realized that connection, trust, and understanding were not weaknesses. They were ways to endure the storms inside, as well as those outside. As the day progressed, clouds began to gather, signaling an approaching storm. Thomas knew they would have to return to the cabin quickly. On the way back, he stumbled on a loose stone, and Sister Anne instinctively grabbed his arm to steady him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, A silent acknowledgment passed between them. Trust was growing, slowly but firmly, in ways that words could not fully capture. Back at the cabin, they secured the windows and doors against the coming storm. The wind howled through the trees, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Thomas worked efficiently, moving with the precision of someone who had faced countless storms, but there was a tension in his shoulders he could not shake. He realized that storms, no matter how well prepared, always brought unpredictability. Sister Anne prepared a small meal while Thomas tended the fire. The storm outside made the cabin feel like a fragile island in a vast sea of wind and rain. They ate in silence, but the silence was comfortable now, filled with the quiet understanding that had developed between them over the past days. As evening fell and the storm raged on, Sister Anne spoke softly. "It hurts," she said again, echoing her words from previous nights. "It hurts to carry so much inside, but we can try again tomorrow and the next day. We can keep trying even when it is hard." Thomas looked at her, feeling the depth of her words. There was truth in what she said. For years he had believed that endurance meant facing life alone. But now he understood that endurance could also mean sharing the burden, allowing someone to walk alongside you through the storm. The night stretched long, and the storm did not let up. Thomas found himself thinking of the past, of the moments he had pushed people away, and of the walls he had built around his heart. Sister Anne's presence reminded him that those walls could be softened, slowly, carefully, and that trust was not a weakness. It was a kind of strength he had not yet fully recognized. Over the following days they faced more challenges together. A fallen tree blocked the path to the stream, requiring them to work together to remove it. A section of the cabin roof needed urgent repair after the storm, and they labored side by side, sharing the effort without complaint. Each task strengthened their bond, showing them that cooperation and patience could overcome even the harshest obstacles. Thomas began to share more of himself, telling Sister Anne stories he had never spoken aloud. He spoke of the loss of his parents, the mistakes he had made in his younger years, and the loneliness that had driven him into the mountains. Sister Anne listened, never judging, always present. Her quiet understanding allowed him to confront the pain he had carried for so long. One evening, as the sun set and painted the mountains in shades of orange and pink, Thomas finally spoke the words he had been holding inside. "I have been afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid that if I let someone in, I will lose control. But I see now that trust does not take away strength. It gives it meaning." Sister Anne smiled gently. "That is all anyone can ask," she said, "to try, to trust, and to keep moving forward, even when it hurts." The storm eventually passed, leaving a clear sky and the fresh smell of rain on the earth. Thomas and Sister Anne sat outside the cabin, watching the mountains bathed in sunlight. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a sense of peace he had not known in a long time. He realized that life in the mountains was not just about survival. It was about connection, patience, and the courage to let someone see the person behind the walls. That evening, as the fire crackled inside the cabin, Thomas reflected on the journey they had shared. The storms they had faced were not only those of the weather, but of the heart. And through it all, he had learned that endurance was not about facing challenges alone. It was about facing them together, with patience, understanding, and trust. He knew that the days ahead would bring more challenges, more tests of patience and resilience. But for now, he allowed himself to feel something he had long thought impossible: hope. Hope that even in the harshest, most isolated places, connection could grow, trust could thrive, and hearts could heal. And as the night deepened and the mountain stood silent outside, Father Thomas understood that he was not alone. Not truly. Sister Anne's presence had changed something inside him, opening a door he had long kept closed. And though the future remained uncertain, he was ready to face it, not with fear or walls, but with patience, courage, and the quiet strength that comes from letting someone in. The next morning, the mountains were calm, wrapped in mist that sparkled as the sun rose. Birds called from the treetops, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Father Thomas woke early, as he always did, but this morning felt different. There was a quiet sense of anticipation, a feeling that the world around him was no longer just a place to survive, but a place to live, to connect, and to grow. Sister Anne had already prepared a small breakfast, placing it on the table with gentle care. Thomas noticed how natural she had become in this rugged environment. She moved through the cabin with confidence and ease, yet always with respect for his space and his routines. Over the past days, she had become more than a visitor. She was a companion, a witness to his life, and someone who had helped him confront the loneliness he had carried for so long. As they ate, Thomas spoke more freely than he had in years. He told her about the small joys he had discovered in mountain life, the first bloom of spring flowers, the sound of the stream in summer, the quiet peace of a snowfall at night. Sister Anne listened, smiling, encouraging him with her presence rather than words. It was in these quiet moments that Thomas realized how much he had been missing. Living in isolation had protected him, but it had also kept him from feeling fully alive. After breakfast, they decided to take a longer walk through the forest. The trail led them along a ridge that overlooked the valley, and Thomas felt the familiar thrill of the mountains, tempered now by the calm assurance of shared company. They walked side by side, moving carefully over roots and stones, but their conversation flowed easily, no longer strained by tension or fear. "I never realized how heavy the past could feel," Thomas said as they paused to rest on a large rock. "I thought I could carry it alone, but it became a burden that even the mountains could not lighten." Sister Anne nodded. "The past is heavy for all of us," she said softly, "but it does not have to define us. We can learn, we can grow, and we can move forward." Thomas looked at her, studying her calm expression. Her presence had changed something inside him, something he could not name but knew was important. For the first time, he understood that trust and connection were not weaknesses, they were strengths, capable of carrying burdens that solitude alone could not manage. As they continued along the trail, they came upon a narrow stream that had overflowed during the previous storm. The water was swift and cold, cutting across their path. Thomas paused, studying the best way to cross. "The mountains always test us," he said, almost to himself, "not just with storms or snow, but with obstacles that demand thought, patience, and care. And we face them together," she said. With her help, they carefully made their way across the stream, balancing on stones and supporting each other when the water threatened to sweep their footing away. When they reached the other side, Thomas felt a surge of gratitude. The experience, though simple, was symbolic. He realized that life could be approached the same way, carefully, patiently, with support from those who cared. Over the next few days, Thomas began to make small changes in his routines. He repaired parts of the cabin he had neglected, tended to his garden more diligently, and even ventured farther down the mountain path than he had in years. Sister Anne encouraged him, not by instructing, but by walking alongside him and showing confidence in his abilities. Her presence had given him courage, the courage to face the unknown and to confront memories that had long haunted him. One afternoon, as they worked to clear debris from a fallen tree near the cabin, Thomas paused and looked out at the valley below. The mountains were bathed in sunlight, and the snow on the peaks glistened like diamonds. He felt a quiet peace he had never known, a sense of belonging that extended beyond the walls of his cabin. Sister Anne watched him, sensing the change. "You have grown stronger," she said softly, "not just in body, but in heart and mind." "I see that now," he admitted. "I have been alone for so long, thinking that solitude was the only way to survive. But it is not enough. We need connection, understanding, someone who cares."
Sister Anne nodded, her eyes gentle. "And that is why we keep trying."
"Even when it hurts, even when it is hard, we do not give up. That is how we grow." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas and Sister Anne sat outside the cabin, watching the sky turn shades of pink, orange, and purple. The air was cool, and the first stars appeared. Thomas felt a sense of gratitude so deep it almost overwhelmed him. He realized that the mountains, which had once been a refuge from pain, were now a place of healing and hope. "I never thought I could feel this way," he said quietly. "Alive, connected, and even a little hopeful. I thought the mountains would always be just a place to survive, but now they are something more. They are a place to live fully." Sister Anne smiled. "Life can be like that," she said. "Even in the most isolated places, we can find meaning, connection, and joy." Over the following days, Thomas continued to share more of his story. He spoke of regrets, of mistakes, of moments he wished he could undo. But he also spoke of lessons learned, of resilience, and of the small victories that had allowed him to endure the harshness of mountain life. Sister Anne listened, offering no judgment, only understanding. Through her patience and kindness, Thomas discovered that facing the past was not a burden, but a path to freedom. By the time Sister Anne's visit came to an end, Thomas had changed in ways he had not expected. He was no longer the isolated man who had greeted her with caution and suspicion. He had learned the value of patience, trust, and shared effort. He had discovered that true strength was not measured by how alone he could endure, but by how openly he could face life alongside someone who cared. On the final morning of her stay, Thomas walked with Sister Anne to the edge of the plateau one last time. The view was as breathtaking as the first day she had arrived, but now it felt different. The mountains no longer represented isolation and loneliness. They represented resilience, hope, and the possibility of connection. "I will never forget this place," Sister Anne said softly, "and I will never forget what you have shared with me." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Nor will I forget you," he replied. "You have shown me that life is richer when we allow others in, even when it is difficult. You have reminded me that endurance is not just about surviving, it is about living." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun rise higher over the peaks. Then, slowly, Sister Anne turned to leave, making her way down the mountain path. Thomas watched her go, feeling a sense of loss, but also of gratitude. Her visit had changed him, and he knew that he would carry her lessons and presence with him always. As the days passed, Thomas settled back into his mountain life. But he did so with a new perspective. He tended his cabin and garden with renewed care, explored the trails with curiosity and confidence, and faced the storms, both of weather and of memory, with patience and courage. The mountains remained vast and challenging, but they no longer felt like a place of isolation. Instead, they were a place of growth, connection, and quiet joy. And on clear nights, when the stars shone brightly over the peaks, Thomas would sit by his fire and remember Sister Anne's words, that endurance was not about facing life alone, but about trusting, sharing, and trying again, even when it hurt. Those words stayed with him, a gentle reminder that human connection was a strength, not a weakness, and that even in the loneliest places, hearts could heal. In the end, Father Thomas was no longer just the mountain man. He was a man transformed, not by the mountains alone, but by the courage to open his heart, the patience to trust, and the understanding that life, with all its storms and challenges, was best faced together. The mountains were still vast and wild, but inside his small cabin there was warmth, hope, and the quiet, unspoken promise that connection could endure, no matter the hardships that lay ahead.